Sarah Mitchell had been tripped 17 times in her first month at Westfield High. She knew because she'd been counting. What nobody realized was that she'd also been drawing. Every face, every sneer, every calculated stumble that sent her books flying across the hallway floor. When Brittany Walsh and her crew made their biggest mistake yet, Sarah was ready with something that would change everything at Westfield High forever. What happened next became the most talked about incident in the school's history, and it all started with a sketchbook nobody knew existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the cold brick wall of Westfield High's main hallway, clutching her worn leather messenger bag like a shield. The September morning chaos swirled around her as students rushed to their first period classes, their voices creating a symphony of belonging that she wasn't part of. At 16, Sarah had mastered the art of becoming invisible, a skill that had served her well during the 3 previous school moves in 4 years. But Westfield High felt different. Here, invisibility wasn't enough. The move to Westfield, Colorado, had been necessary but unwelcome. Her mother, Lisa's job at the Denver Medical Center required a 2-hour commute each way, and the rent in their previous neighborhood had skyrocketed beyond what a single parent could manage on a medical technician's salary. Sarah understood the financial realities that governed their lives, but understanding didn't make starting over any easier. The modest 2-bedroom apartment they now called home sat on the wrong side of the school district lines, where the houses were smaller and the cars were older. Sarah's auburn hair caught the fluorescent light as she carefully navigated toward her locker, her artist's eye automatically cataloging the social geography around her. 3 weeks into the school year, she had already mapped the invisible territories that govern teenage life. The athletes owned the center hallway, their Letterman jackets and confident laughter marking their domain. The theater kids clustered near the drama room, gesturing dramatically even in casual conversation. The honor students moved with purposeful efficiency, their backpacks heavy with advanced placement textbooks. And then there were the untouchables like Sarah, who moved through the spaces between established groups, hoping to reach their destinations without incident. What made Sarah different from the other social outcasts was her gift for observation and her ability to capture what she saw with startling accuracy. Her sketchbook, hidden in the bottom of her messenger bag, contained detailed drawings of her new environment, each face rendered with the precision that came from years of practicing her craft in silence. Sarah had discovered her artistic abilities early, spending countless hours during her childhood copying illustrations from library books when her mother worked late shifts. Art had become her constant companion through multiple moves and new schools, a skill that traveled well and asked nothing from others. While her classmates made friends over shared interests in sports or music, Sarah found solace in her ability to translate the world around her onto paper with remarkable detail. The morning rush was beginning to thin when Sarah spotted them. Approaching, Brittany Walsh moved through the hallway like royalty touring her kingdom, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light with each calculated step. As captain of Westfield's competitive dance team and daughter of the town's most successful real estate developer, Brittany commanded attention effortlessly. Her designer clothes fit perfectly, her makeup was flawless, and her smile carried the confidence that came with never doubting your place in the world. Flanking Brittany were her constant companions. Chloe Martinez walked slightly behind and to the left, her dark hair styled in deliberate imitation of her leader. Chloe's desperation for acceptance was visible in the way she laughed too loudly at Brittany's comments and rushed to agree with every opinion. Her family owned a successful restaurant in town, providing enough money to keep up with Brittany's lifestyle, but never enough to truly belong. Amber Stevens completed the trio. Her athletic build, and intimidating stare serving as the group's enforcer. As a star volleyball player with a full scholarship already secured to Colorado State, Amber had the physical presence that made others step aside. Sarah had been carefully avoiding this particular hallway intersection for the past week, but her need to reach the art room before first period had forced her to take the direct route. She kept her eyes down and her pace steady, hoping to slip past unnoticed. The strategy had worked with other groups, but Sarah was beginning to understand that Brittany's crew operated by different rules. "Well, look what we have here," Brittany's voice carried across the hallway with perfect projection, trained by years of dance performances. "The mystery girl who thinks she's too good to talk to anyone." Sarah continued walking, her grip tightening on her messenger bag. She had learned that engagement only made situations worse, that bullies fed on reaction and lost interest in non-responsive targets. This wisdom had served her well in previous schools, but Sarah was beginning to realize that Westfield High's social dynamics were more aggressive than she had experienced before. "I'm talking to you, art girl," Brittany called out, using the dismissive nickname that had somehow attached itself to Sarah within her first week. The label wasn't entirely inaccurate. Sarah did spend her lunch periods in the art room with Ms. Rodriguez, and she did carry her messenger bag instead of a traditional backpack. But the way Brittany said it made creativity sound like a character flaw. Sarah paused, her instincts warring between flight and politeness. Her mother had raised her to be respectful to others, even when they didn't deserve it. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were talking to me," she said quietly, turning to face the trio. Brittany's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course you didn't. You're always in your own little world, aren't you? Too special to notice the rest of us, ordinary people." The accusation was so far from the truth that Sarah almost laughed. She spent her time observing others with intense focus, memorizing details that most people missed. Her sketchbook contained more accurate portraits of her classmates than the official school yearbook would capture. But explaining this would require revealing the extent of her artistic abilities, something she had learned to keep private. "I'm just trying to get to class," Sarah said, attempting to step around the group. "That's when it happened." Amber shifted slightly to the left, extending her foot just enough to catch Sarah's ankle as she passed. The trip was expertly executed, subtle enough to appear accidental while being perfectly timed to send Sarah stumbling forward. Her messenger bag swung wide as she fought to regain her balance, and several folders scattered across the hallway floor. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," Amber exclaimed with practiced innocence, her voice carrying just enough to attract attention from nearby students. "I totally didn't see you there." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Here, let me help you with that." Sarah knelt to gather her scattered papers, her face burning with embarrassment as students stepped around her, some pausing to watch the entertainment. This was the pattern she had been documenting for 3 weeks. The accidental trips, the fake apologies, the public humiliation designed to reinforce her status as an outsider. "You really should be more careful," Brittany observed, her tone dripping with false concern. "Someone could get hurt if you keep stumbling around like that." Sarah finished collecting her papers and stood up, meeting Brittany's gaze for just a moment. In that brief contact, she saw something that chilled her. This wasn't random cruelty or teenage thoughtlessness. Brittany's eyes held a calculating intelligence, the look of someone who had identified a target and was planning a campaign. Sarah was dealing with a predator who had chosen her specifically. "Thanks for the advice," Sarah managed, her voice steadier than she felt. As she walked away, Sarah heard Chloe's theatrical whisper, "Did you see how she looked at you? So weird and intense, kind of creepy if you ask me." Sarah made it to the art room with 2 minutes to spare before first period. Ms. Rodriguez was arranging supplies for the day's lesson, her warm smile providing a stark contrast to the hallway encounter. Maria Rodriguez had been teaching art at Westfield High for 12 years, and she had developed an eye for students who needed sanctuary as much as instruction. "Morning, Sarah," Ms. Rodriguez said, looking up from a box of charcoal pencils. "You're here early again. Everything okay?" Sarah nodded, taking her usual seat near the back corner where she could observe the room while remaining relatively hidden. "Just wanted to finish something before class starts." It wasn't entirely true. Sarah had come early because the art room felt safe, because Ms. Rodriguez treated her artistic abilities as gifts rather than oddities, and because she needed a few minutes to process what had just happened in the hallway. More importantly, she needed to add new details to her growing documentation. Sarah opened her messenger bag and carefully extracted her sketchbook, a professional grade pad that her mother had splurged on for her birthday despite their tight budget. The book was nearly half full with detailed drawings from her time at Westfield High. Unlike a typical teenager's doodles, Sarah's sketches were precise character studies that captured not just physical features, but emotional states and personality traits. She flipped to a fresh page and began sketching, her hand moving with practiced confidence as she recreated the scene from the hallway. Brittany's calculating smile emerged first, every detail of her expression captured with startling accuracy. Sarah had a gift for remembering faces, a form of photographic memory that extended specifically to visual details. She could recall the exact angle of Amber's extended foot, the precise timing of Chloe's theatrical gasp, the way other students had arranged themselves around the incident. As her pencil moved across the paper, Sarah realized she was creating more than just artwork. She was building evidence. Each accidental trip, each cruel comment, each moment of public humiliation was being preserved with courtroom quality, accuracy. What had started as a coping mechanism was becoming something else entirely. Ms. Rodriguez appeared beside her desk, studying the emerging sketch with professional interest. "Your observational skills are remarkable, Sarah. Have you considered that art can be more than personal expression? Sometimes it becomes a form of witness, a way of preserving truth." Sarah looked up at her teacher, wondering if Ms. Rodriguez understood more about her situation than she had revealed. "I just draw what I see." "And what you see is worth preserving," Ms. Rodriguez replied. "Great artists throughout history have used their talents to shine light on injustice. Sometimes, a single image can change everything." The first period bell rang and students began filtering into the classroom. Sarah quickly closed her sketchbook and tucked it away, but Ms. Rodriguez's words echoed in her mind. Art as witness, truth preservation. The idea that her private documentation might serve a larger purpose was both thrilling and terrifying. As Sarah prepared for another day of navigating Westfield High's treacherous social waters, she had no idea that her artistic abilities would soon become the catalyst for a transformation that would reshape the entire school's culture. The quiet new girl with the sketchbook was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon against cruelty is the truth, captured with perfect clarity and shared with the world. The foundation was being laid for a confrontation that would expose not just individual bullies, but an entire system that allowed cruelty to flourish. Sarah Mitchell was about to learn that being invisible had given her the perfect vantage point to see everything, and that seeing everything meant she had the power to change everything. But first, she had to survive 17 more trips, countless humiliations, and the destruction of something precious. The real test was still coming, and when it arrived, Sarah would be ready with her sketchbook, her talent, and a plan that nobody saw coming. The discovery of Sarah's true artistic abilities happened by accident, though looking back, Ms. Rodriguez would later say that talent that extraordinary was impossible to hide forever. It was during the third week of October when Sarah arrived at the art room during lunch period to find her usual corner occupied by a group of seniors working on their portfolio pieces. Rather than retreat to the cafeteria, where she risked another encounter with Brittany's crew, Sarah settled at a table near the front of the room where Ms. Rodriguez was grading assignments. Sarah pulled out her sketchbook, intending to work on her ongoing documentation project, when she noticed a still life arrangement that Ms. Rodriguez had set up for the advanced placement students. The composition featured a weathered violin, resting against a stack of leather-bound books, with dramatic lighting creating deep shadows and highlighting the instrument's worn varnish. Most students would need several class periods to capture such a complex arrangement, but Sarah found herself drawn to the challenge. Without conscious thought, her pencil began moving across a fresh page. Her hand worked with mechanical precision, translating the three-dimensional scene into two-dimensional perfection. The violin's F-holes emerged with mathematical accuracy. The book's aged spines showed individual wear patterns, and the play of light and shadow was rendered with photorealistic detail. Sarah's gift wasn't just artistic talent, it was an almost supernatural ability to see and reproduce visual information with camera-like fidelity. Ms. Rodriguez noticed the intense concentration radiating from Sarah's corner and quietly approached to observe her work. What she saw made her catch her breath audibly. In less than 20 minutes, Sarah had produced a drawing that rivaled the work of professional illustrators. Every detail was perfect, from the violin's delicate scroll to the subtle texture of aged leather bindings. The shading demonstrated an understanding of light physics that most art students never achieved. "Sarah," Ms. Rodriguez whispered, careful not to startle her, "how long have you been drawing like this?" Sarah looked up, suddenly self-conscious about the attention. "I don't know. I just see things and draw them. It's not really special." Ms. Rodriguez sat down beside her, studying the drawing with professional amazement. "This isn't just special, Sarah. This is extraordinary. You have a gift that most artists spend decades trying to develop. Have you had formal training?" Sarah shook her head, explaining how her artistic education had consisted of library books and countless hours of solitary practice. She described her ability to remember visual details with perfect clarity, how she could close her eyes and replay scenes like watching a movie in her mind. What she didn't mention was how this ability had become her survival mechanism, allowing her to document every instance of cruelty she witnessed or experienced. Ms. Rodriguez understood that she was looking at raw genius, the kind of natural ability that appeared perhaps once in a teaching career. More importantly, she recognized that Sarah's talent was being wasted in an environment where she felt unsafe and unwelcome. The teacher began forming plans for nurturing this gift while providing Sarah with the confidence to share it with the world. "Sarah, I want to propose something," Ms. Rodriguez said carefully. "There's a statewide high school art competition in November. The theme this year is Truth in Art, and I think you should enter. Your work deserves to be seen." Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse. Drawing was her private escape, her secret method of processing a hostile world. Making her art public felt like removing armor when she was already vulnerable. But Ms. Rodriguez's enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since arriving at Westfield High, Sarah felt like someone believed in her potential. Their conversation was interrupted by the lunch bell, sending students streaming back toward their lockers. Sarah quickly closed her sketchbook and gathered her supplies, but Ms. Rodriguez's words echoed in her mind throughout the afternoon. Truth in art. The phrase seemed particularly relevant given what she had been documenting in her private sketches. That afternoon, Sarah's usual route to her final class took her past the gymnasium where Brittany's dance team was practicing for an upcoming competition. Through the partially opened doors, she could see the synchronized movements of 20 girls, moving in perfect formation. Brittany stood at the center, her leadership evident in every gesture and command. Sarah paused to watch, her artist's eye appreciating the technical skill and precision required for their routine. That moment of stillness made her a perfect target. Amber Stevens appeared beside her, as if materializing from nowhere, using Sarah's distraction to execute another accidental encounter. This time, the collision was more aggressive, sending Sarah stumbling backward into the wall while her messenger bag flew open, spilling contents across the hallway floor. "Oh, wow, sorry about that," Amber said with mock sincerity, her voice loud enough to attract attention from passing students. "I was rushing to practice and didn't see you lurking there." Sarah knelt to gather her scattered belongings. Her movements hurried as students began to cluster around the scene. Her worst fear materialized when her sketchbook landed face open, revealing one of her detailed drawings to anyone who cared to look. The exposed page showed a precise portrait of 3 girls she recognized as cheerleaders, captured during what appeared to be a moment of cruel laughter. Chloe Martinez appeared beside Amber, drawn by the commotion and opportunity for entertainment. Her eyes immediately fixed on the open sketchbook, and her expression shifted from bored curiosity to sharp interest. "What's that? Are you drawing people without permission?" Sarah reached for her sketchbook, but Chloe was faster, snatching it up before Sarah could react. The violation felt like having her diary read aloud in public, exposing her most private thoughts and observations to hostile scrutiny. "Oh my God, this is creepy," Chloe announced, flipping through pages filled with detailed portraits and scene documentation. "She's been stalking people and drawing them. Look at this one of the basketball team. And here's the drama club. She's like some kind of weird artist spy." A crowd was gathering, drawn by the spectacle of conflict and the promise of fresh gossip. Sarah stood frozen, watching her private world being exposed and mischaracterized by someone who couldn't possibly understand the purpose behind her documentation. Her artistic gift, the one thing that brought her joy and comfort, was being twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. Amber took the sketchbook from Chloe, examining the drawings with theatrical disgust. "This is seriously disturbing. Who gives you permission to draw all these people? It's like you're collecting them or something." "Please give that back," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of interested spectators. "Those are just practice drawings." "Practice for what?" Amber demanded, holding the sketchbook above her head where Sarah couldn't reach it. "Practice for being a total creep? These aren't just drawings. They're like surveillance photos, but drawn. You've been watching everyone and documenting us like we're specimens in a lab." The crowd pressed closer, eager to examine the evidence of Sarah's alleged wrongdoing. Students who had never spoken to her before were now discussing her character and motivations with authority. Sarah realized with growing horror that her artistic documentation was being reinterpreted as stalking behavior, that her coping mechanism was being used as proof of her social unfitness. Ms. Rodriguez's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "What's going on here?" The teacher had emerged from the gymnasium where she had been observing dance practice, drawn by the unusual crowd formation in the hallway. Her presence immediately changed the dynamic, sending some students scattering, while others remained to watch the adult intervention. "Ms. Rodriguez, you need to see this," Chloe said, presenting the sketchbook like evidence at a trial. "Sarah has been secretly drawing everyone in school. It's really weird and creepy. She has pictures of people who don't even know she exists." Ms. Rodriguez took the sketchbook and examined the exposed drawings, her expression carefully neutral. Sarah watched in agony as her teacher studied the portraits and scene documentation, knowing that Ms. Rodriguez was seeing her work in an entirely different context than their private classroom conversations. "These are remarkable drawings," Ms. Rodriguez said finally, her voice carrying authority that made the surrounding students lean in to hear. "Sarah has extraordinary artistic talent, and these appear to be observational studies, which are a standard part of any serious artist's practice." "But she didn't ask permission," Amber protested, sensing that the narrative was shifting away from their intended direction. "You can't just draw people without telling them. It's invasive." Ms. Rodriguez closed the sketchbook and handed it back to Sarah, her action clearly stating where her allegiance lay. "Artists have been making observational drawings of people in public spaces for centuries. It's how we learn to see and understand the world around us. There's nothing inappropriate about studying human behavior and expression through art." The crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the lack of scandal and the teacher's refusal to validate their outrage. Amber and Chloe exchanged frustrated glances, realizing that their attempt to embarrass Sarah had been neutralized by adult intervention. "Just keep your weird drawings to yourself," Amber muttered as she walked away, her parting shot lacking the impact she had intended. Sarah stood, alone with Ms. Rodriguez in the emptying hallway, clutching her recovered sketchbook against her chest like a shield. The public exposure of her private world felt like a violation that would take time to recover from, but her teacher's defense had prevented complete catastrophe. "Are you okay?" Ms. Rodriguez asked gently, recognizing the trauma of having one's private artistic work displayed and criticized by hostile viewers. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was being truthful. "Thank you for standing up for me. I thought they were going to destroy it." Ms. Rodriguez studied her students' face, seeing beyond the surface embarrassment to the deeper fear underneath. "Sarah, your drawings aren't just practice exercises, are they? You're documenting something specific." The perceptive question hung in the air between them, creating a moment of decision for Sarah. She could continue pretending that her artistic documentation was purely aesthetic, or she could trust her teacher with the truth about what she had really been recording. "I draw what happens to me," Sarah admitted quietly, "and what happens to other people like me. I thought if I had pictures, if I could show proof, maybe someone would believe that it's really happening." Ms. Rodriguez felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Sarah's isolation, her careful observation of social dynamics, her reluctance to engage with other students, the precision with which she captured moments of interpersonal conflict. The girl wasn't just making art, she was gathering evidence. "Sarah, how often do these incidents happen?" "Every day," Sarah replied, surprised by her own honesty. "Sometimes multiple times. I started counting and drawing because I thought I might be imagining it, making it worse than it really was. But the drawings don't lie." Ms. Rodriguez realized she was looking at more than an isolated bullying situation. Sarah was documenting a systematic campaign of harassment that had been flying under the radar of adult supervision. The teacher's protective instincts engaged fully as she understood the scope of what her student was enduring. "I want you to know that what you're experiencing isn't acceptable, and it's not your fault," Ms. Rodriguez said firmly. "Your drawings could be important evidence if you ever decide to report what's happening. But more than that, they could be powerful art that speaks truth about experiences that too many students share." Sarah looked up at her teacher with something approaching hope. For the first time since arriving at Westfield High, an adult was not only believing her, but suggesting that her response to cruelty could become something meaningful and impactful. "The competition I mentioned," Ms. Rodriguez continued, "the theme is truth in art. What you've been creating fits perfectly. You're not just drawing portraits, you're revealing hidden realities that need to be seen." As they walked toward the art room together, Sarah began to imagine possibilities beyond mere documentation. Her sketchbook could become more than a private record of injustice. It could become a voice for students who felt voiceless, a mirror that reflected uncomfortable truths about how schools really operated. The seeds of transformation were being planted, though Sarah had no idea how dramatically her world was about to change. Her artistic abilities were about to become a force for justice, but first, she would face her greatest challenge yet. Part 3. The Systematic Campaign. October's crisp autumn air carried the promise of change, but for Sarah Mitchell, each new day brought fresh evidence that her situation at Westfield High was deteriorating rather than improving. The public exposure of her sketchbook had shifted the dynamics of her persecution in ways she hadn't anticipated. Where once the harassment had been somewhat random and opportunistic, it now felt coordinated and personal. Brittany Walsh had elevated Sarah from casual target to primary focus, treating her systematic torment like a strategic campaign. The dance team captain possessed a cunning intelligence that made her particularly dangerous. She understood how to operate within the gray areas of school policy while maximizing psychological damage. Her methods were sophisticated enough to avoid clear disciplinary consequences while maintaining relentless pressure on her chosen victim. The morning routine had become a psychological minefield for Sarah. She would arrive at school 20 minutes early, hoping to navigate the hallways before the main crowd arrived. But Brittany seemed to have anticipated this strategy, arriving even earlier with her core group to intercept Sarah at strategic locations. They had identified her patterns and adjusted their timing accordingly, demonstrating a level of planning that elevated their cruelty beyond typical teenage meanness. The first major escalation occurred during a particularly crowded lunch period. Sarah had claimed her usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria, positioning herself where she could observe the room while maintaining relative isolation. She was working on a detailed sketch of the social geography around her when Brittany's voice suddenly echoed across the entire space. "Oh my God, everyone! Look who's drawing us again!" Brittany announced, her voice carrying the perfect mix of amusement and outrage. "The creepy artist girl is back to her stalking hobby." The cafeteria fell silent as hundreds of students turned to stare at Sarah, who found herself suddenly illuminated by unwanted attention. Her carefully constructed invisibility evaporated as every eye in the room focused on her corner table. The exposure felt like being caught in a spotlight while wearing no clothes. Chloe Martinez joined the performance with practiced enthusiasm. "I heard she has like a whole book of secret drawings of people. It's really disturbing. Who does that?" "Someone who's planning something weird," Amber Stevens added, her athletic frame moving through the crowd with predatory grace. "Normal? People don't secretly document everyone around them. It's creepy behavior." Sarah closed her sketchbook and began gathering her belongings, desperate to escape the public scrutiny. But her movement only seemed to confirm their narrative of suspicious behavior. Students throughout the cafeteria began whispering among themselves, spreading theories about her motivations and mental state. "Where are you going, artist girl?" Brittany called out as Sarah stood to leave. "Don't you want to draw the audience you've attracted? This would make a great addition to your stalker collection." The term stalker collection was particularly effective because it reframed Sarah's artistic documentation as predatory behavior. Students who might have been sympathetic to a bullying victim were less likely to support someone characterized as a threat to their privacy. Brittany had successfully positioned herself as protecting the student body from Sarah's alleged misconduct. Sarah made it halfway to the cafeteria exit before Amber appeared in her path, seemingly engaged in animated conversation with friends, but positioned to create an unavoidable collision. The accidental contact was more aggressive than previous incidents, sending Sarah stumbling backward into a crowded table where senior students were eating lunch. The impact scattered food and drinks across multiple people, creating chaos and angry shouts from students whose meals had been ruined. Sarah found herself at the center of a mess she hadn't intended, apologizing frantically while trying to help clean up the damage. The seniors' anger was directed at her, not at Amber, who had actually caused the collision, reinforcing Sarah's role as the problem rather than the victim. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Brittany declared, appearing beside the disaster scene like a prosecutor presenting evidence. She's so focused on watching everyone that she can't even walk straight. Someone's going to get seriously hurt if this keeps happening. The narrative was masterfully constructed. Brittany had transformed an aggressive act by her ally into proof of Sarah's carelessness and social dysfunction. The crowd saw Sarah at the center of chaos and conflict, confirming the characterization of her as disruptive and problematic. Principal Henderson arrived to assess the situation, drawn by the unusual commotion in what was normally a peaceful lunch period. He found Sarah surrounded by angry students, food scattered across tables and floor, and what appeared to be clear evidence of disruptive behavior. The administrative perspective was exactly what Brittany had calculated it would be. "Ms. Mitchell, what happened here?" Principal Henderson asked, his tone suggesting that he already assumed her responsibility for the chaos. Sarah tried to explain about the collision and the circumstances that had led to the accident, but her words sounded defensive and unconvincing even to her own ears. She couldn't prove that Amber had deliberately created the contact without seeming paranoid and accusatory. "It was an accident," Sarah said finally, accepting responsibility for consequences beyond her control. "I'll help pay for any food that was wasted." Principal Henderson nodded approvingly at her acceptance of accountability, unaware that he was rewarding the victim while the actual perpetrators watched with satisfaction. Brittany's strategy had successfully manipulated adult perception, making Sarah appear responsible for problems created by her tormentors. The incident established a pattern that would repeat throughout October. Sarah would be maneuvered into situations where she appeared to be the source of disruption, while her actual harassers maintained plausible deniability. Teachers and administrators saw a troubled student who couldn't seem to navigate social situations appropriately, not recognizing the calculated campaign being waged against her. The psychological pressure began affecting Sarah's academic performance. Her concentration in classes suffered as she constantly monitored her environment for potential threats. Simple tasks like walking to her locker became strategic operations, requiring careful timing and route planning. The chronic stress of hypervigilance was exhausting, leaving her drained and emotionally depleted. Ms. Rodriguez noticed the changes in her most talented student during their art class sessions. Sarah's work remained technically excellent, but her enthusiasm seemed diminished. The observational drawings continued, but they carried a darker emotional weight that troubled the experienced teacher. "Sarah, you seem distracted lately," Ms. Rodriguez observed during a particularly quiet afternoon session. "Is everything going okay?" Sarah considered telling her teacher about the escalating harassment, but the words felt inadequate to describe the sophisticated nature of what she was experiencing. How could she explain that she was being systematically isolated and characterized as a threat by students who were actually threatening her? "Just adjusting to the school," Sarah replied, focusing on her drawing to avoid eye contact. "Everything's fine." Ms. Rodriguez recognized the deflection, but chose not to press the issue directly. Instead, she made a mental note to observe more carefully and provide additional support however possible. The teacher's instincts told her that Sarah was struggling with something beyond normal adjustment challenges. The harassment campaign's most insidious aspect was its effect on other students' perceptions of Sarah. Brittany's characterizations had been so effective that former neutral parties now viewed Sarah with suspicion and discomfort. Students who might have naturally gravitated toward friendship with a fellow outsider instead maintained their distance, believing the narrative about her disturbing behavior. Jake Thompson, a quiet junior who spent most of his time in the computer lab, had initially felt kinship with another socially isolated student. But the cafeteria incident and subsequent gossip had made him reconsider any potential friendship. Like most students, Jake preferred to avoid association with someone who attracted negative attention and administrative scrutiny. Sarah's isolation deepened as October progressed. The few tentative social connections she had begun forming evaporated under pressure from the dominant narrative about her character. She ate lunch alone, walked the hallways alone, and spent her free periods in the art room where Ms. Rodriguez provided the only adult relationship that felt safe and supportive. The documentation in her sketchbook grew more detailed and extensive as the harassment escalated. Each accidental trip, each public humiliation, each moment of deliberate social sabotage was captured with courtroom-quality precision. Sarah's artistic ability had become both her sanctuary and her weapon, though she hadn't yet realized the power she was accumulating. Her drawings revealed patterns that would have been invisible to casual observation. The timing of incidents, the coordination between different members of Brittany's group, the strategic locations chosen for maximum impact and minimal adult supervision. Sarah was creating an evidence file that documented not just individual acts of cruelty, but a systematic campaign of harassment. The psychological warfare reached new levels of sophistication when Brittany began incorporating Sarah's family circumstances into her attacks. Through careful social media research and community connections, she had discovered details about Sarah's economic situation and family structure that provided fresh ammunition for public humiliation. "I heard her mom works like 3 jobs just to afford their tiny apartment," Chloe whispered loudly during passing period, positioned where Sarah couldn't avoid overhearing. "That's why she always wears the same clothes and carries that ancient bag. They're basically homeless." The attack on her family's dignity cut deeper than personal insults ever could. Sarah's mother worked exhausting hours to provide for them, sacrificing her own comfort and opportunities to ensure Sarah had educational possibilities. Having their financial struggles characterized as shameful and pathetic felt like a violation of everything her mother had sacrificed to achieve. Amber added her own contribution to the economic shaming campaign. "Did you know she takes the city bus to school because they can't afford a car? I saw her waiting at the stop yesterday looking all pathetic and wet from the rain. It's actually kind of sad." The transportation issue had been a particular source of anxiety for Sarah. Most Westfield High students drove their own cars or were dropped off by parents, making her bus dependency another visible marker of difference. What should have been a neutral transportation choice became evidence of social and economic inadequacy. Sarah's sketchbook captured these moments of public humiliation with devastating accuracy. Her drawings showed not just the speakers, but the audiences, the faces of students who listened and laughed and spread the cruel characterizations further. She was documenting not just individual cruelty, but the collective participation in her systematic dehumanization. The campaign's effectiveness lay in its ability to make Sarah complicit in her own isolation. Each incident was crafted to make her appear responsible for negative outcomes, creating a narrative where her very presence at school was problematic. Teachers and administrators saw disruption following her throughout the building, not recognizing that she was the target rather than the cause. By the end of October, Sarah's position at Westfield High had become untenable. She was universally viewed as strange, disruptive, and potentially threatening. Her artistic talents were characterized as creepy obsessions. Her family's financial struggles were public entertainment, and her daily existence was a series of calculated humiliations designed to drive her away. But Sarah possessed something her tormentors hadn't anticipated: perfect visual memory and the artistic skill to transform observations into undeniable evidence. Her sketchbook had become a detailed record of systematic harassment, complete with dates, times, locations, and participant identifications. She was accumulating power without realizing it, building toward a revelation that would change everything at Westfield High. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose not just individual bullies, but an entire social system that enabled and rewarded cruelty. Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that sometimes the most effective revenge is simply revealing the truth with perfect clarity. Part 4. The Weight of Silence. November arrived at Westfield High with an unseasonable warmth that felt ominous rather than pleasant, as if the weather itself was holding its breath before something significant happened. For Sarah Mitchell, the month began with a devastating realization. Her carefully constructed strategies for survival were no longer working. The harassment had evolved beyond random cruelty into something that felt like psychological warfare, and she was losing ground every day. The morning ritual had become unbearable. Sarah would wake at 5:30, allowing herself extra time to map alternative routes through the school building that might avoid Brittany's strategic positioning. She had identified 17 different pathways between her classes, memorizing which hallways offered the best sightlines for early threat detection and which provided emergency exits if situations became too dangerous. But Brittany Walsh's intelligence network had grown more sophisticated throughout October. The dance team captain seemed to have recruitment tentacles reaching into every social group, gathering information about Sarah's movements and habits from students who didn't even realize they were participating in surveillance. Casual questions about when someone had seen the weird artist girl were actually intelligence gathering that fed into a larger strategic plan. The systematic nature of the harassment became apparent during what should have been Sarah's safest period, art class. Ms. Rodriguez had created an environment where creativity flourished and individual expression was celebrated. But even this sanctuary was being infiltrated by Brittany's influence network. The invasion began subtly during a group critique session where students were meant to offer constructive feedback on each other's work. Sarah had submitted a charcoal portrait that demonstrated her extraordinary technical skill, a drawing so realistic it looked like a black and white photograph. Under normal circumstances, such work would have generated admiration and respect from her classmates. Instead, the critique session became an opportunity for character assassination disguised as artistic analysis. Jessica Palmer, a cheerleader who had never shown interest in art before, raised her hand to offer feedback that had clearly been rehearsed. The technical skill is obvious, but there's something really disturbing about how perfectly she captures people's faces, Jessica said, her tone suggesting deep concern rather than criticism. It makes me wonder if she's studying us for reasons that aren't just about art. Like, why does she need to remember exactly how we look? The comment was designed to make Sarah's greatest strength appear threatening. Her photographic memory and artistic precision, which should have been celebrated as gifts, were being reframed as evidence of predatory behavior. Other students in the class began shifting uncomfortably, viewing Sarah's abilities through this new lens of suspicion. Another student, Michael Chen, who had previously been friendly towards Sarah, picked up the thread of criticism. "I've noticed she draws a lot of scenes where people look upset or angry. Maybe she's only interested in capturing negative emotions, which is kind of weird." Ms. Rodriguez attempted to redirect the conversation toward constructive artistic feedback, but the damage was already being done. Sarah's classmates were being taught to view her artistic documentation as evidence of disturbed psychology rather than skilled observation. The narrative was shifting in real time, transforming her from talented student to potential threat. Sarah sat in silence throughout the critique, watching her artistic sanctuary being contaminated by the same poisonous dynamics that ruled the rest of her school experience. The one place where she had felt safe and valued was being invaded by forces beyond her control, leaving her with nowhere to retreat. The psychological pressure intensified when Sarah discovered that her private conversations with Ms. Rodriguez were being monitored and reported back to Brittany's network. She learned this when Chloe Martinez approached her during lunch period, with information that could only have come from inside the art room. "I heard you think you're some kind of artistic genius," Chloe said, positioning herself where other students could overhear the conversation. "Ms. Rodriguez has been filling your head with ideas about entering competitions and showing your work publicly. That's really dangerous thinking for someone with your social problems." The violation felt profound and disorienting. Sarah had believed that her relationship with Ms. Rodriguez was private and protected, but apparently even teacher-student conversations were being compromised. The realization that she had no truly safe spaces left at Westfield High was crushing to her remaining hope for positive change. Brittany appeared beside Chloe, as if materializing from thin air, her timing suggesting careful coordination rather than coincidence. "We're actually worried about you, Sarah. This whole artistic obsession combined with your social isolation is creating a really unhealthy pattern. Maybe you should consider transferring to a school with better resources for students with your particular needs." The suggestion was presented as concern for Sarah's well-being, but the underlying message was clear: leave voluntarily or face escalated pressure designed to force departure. Brittany was offering what appeared to be a reasonable solution while actually delivering an ultimatum wrapped in false compassion. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah replied quietly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else." Brittany's expression shifted slightly, revealing a flash of genuine anger beneath her carefully constructed mask of concern. "That's unfortunate because things are going to get much more difficult for you if you insist on staying where you're clearly not wanted." The threat was delivered with a smile that made it even more chilling. Sarah realized she was dealing with someone who enjoyed the process of systematic destruction, who found satisfaction in methodically dismantling another person's sense of safety and belonging. That afternoon, Sarah discovered the true extent of Brittany's influence network when she found herself completely isolated during an emergency fire drill. The evacuation procedures required students to line up with their assigned groups and proceed to designated areas outside the building. Sarah took her assigned position, but the students who should have been around her mysteriously shifted away, leaving her standing alone in a crowd of hundreds. The isolation was so complete and obvious that teachers began to notice, asking Sarah why she wasn't with her designated group. She couldn't explain that her classmates were deliberately avoiding her without sounding paranoid, so she accepted responsibility for the apparent mistake and endured additional scrutiny from school staff. Brittany had orchestrated a demonstration of power that showed Sarah exactly how extensive her social control had become. With minimal effort, she had manipulated dozens of students into participating in Sarah's public isolation, creating a visible spectacle that reinforced the narrative of Sarah as a problematic outsider. The fire drill incident marked a turning point in Sarah's psychological state. The constant stress of hypervigilance, combined with the systematic erosion of her support systems, was beginning to affect her physical health. She experienced frequent headaches, had difficulty sleeping, and found herself losing weight due to decreased appetite and the anxiety that accompanied every meal period. Her mother Lisa noticed the changes during their limited time together. In the evenings, Sarah's normally steady demeanor had become fragile and reactive, and her enthusiasm for artistic projects had diminished noticeably. The concerned parent attempted to initiate conversations about school experiences, but Sarah deflected inquiries with practiced skill. "Just tired from adjusting to everything," Sarah would say, avoiding eye contact while focusing on homework. Assignments. New schools always take time to feel normal. Lisa Mitchell possessed the intuitive awareness that came from raising a daughter as a single parent, but her demanding work schedule limited her ability to investigate concerning changes in Sarah's behavior. The family's financial pressures meant that Lisa often worked double shifts, leaving Sarah alone during the evening hours when problems might have been discussed and addressed. The isolation at home mirrored Sarah's isolation at school, creating a complete absence of emotional support systems. She was carrying the weight of systematic harassment without anyone to share the burden or provide perspective on her experiences. The psychological pressure was becoming unsustainable, but Sarah had been conditioned to believe that seeking help would only create additional problems. Her sketchbook became the sole outlet for processing the trauma she was experiencing daily. The drawings grew darker and more emotionally intense as November progressed, capturing not just external events, but internal states of despair and hopelessness. Sarah was documenting her own psychological deterioration alongside the systematic campaign being waged against her. The artistic documentation had become compulsive rather than therapeutic. Sarah found herself drawing constantly, unable to focus on other activities without her pencil in hand. The need to capture and preserve evidence of her experiences had evolved into an obsession that provided temporary relief but no lasting solutions. Miss Rodriguez noticed the changes in Sarah's artwork during their individual conferences. The technical skill remained extraordinary, but the emotional content had shifted toward themes of isolation, surveillance, and psychological pressure. The teacher recognized signs of serious distress, but struggled to address concerns without concrete evidence of specific problems. "Sarah, your recent work shows tremendous emotional depth, but I'm concerned about the darkness of the themes you're exploring," Ms. Rodriguez said carefully during a private conversation. "Art can be therapeutic, but it can also be a way of processing difficult experiences. Is there anything you want to talk about?" Sarah considered revealing the full extent of her situation, but the knowledge that her conversations with Ms. Rodriguez were being monitored made honesty feel dangerous. Any admission of struggle could be weaponized against her by students who were already characterizing her as mentally unstable. "I'm just exploring different emotional territories in my work," Sarah replied, using language she had learned from art criticism readings. "Artists are supposed to examine difficult subjects, right?" Ms. Rodriguez recognized the deflection, but felt constrained by professional boundaries and the absence of concrete evidence. Without specific incidents to report or clear admissions of problems from Sarah herself, the teacher could only provide general support while hoping that additional resources might become available. The psychological warfare reached its most sophisticated level when Brittany began manipulating academic situations to create failure scenarios for Sarah. Through careful social engineering, she arranged for group projects to exclude Sarah, study, groups to mysteriously change locations, and assignment information to be withheld from her target. The academic sabotage was particularly insidious because it attacked Sarah's strongest area of competence. Her grades had always been her source of pride and her pathway toward future opportunities. But now even classroom success was being systematically undermined by her tormentors. A chemistry project that required laboratory partners became an exercise in public rejection when every potential collaborator claimed to already have commitments. Sarah found herself without a partner despite her strong academic record, forcing her to complete double the work while appearing socially incompetent to her teacher. The pattern repeated across multiple subjects as Brittany's network expanded its influence into academic areas. Sarah's previous reputation as a reliable and capable student was being eroded by carefully orchestrated scenarios that made her appear disorganized and antisocial. The academic pressure combined with social isolation created a feedback loop of stress that was becoming impossible to manage. Sarah's carefully maintained composure began showing cracks as the multiple fronts of harassment overwhelmed her coping mechanisms. The breaking point was approaching rapidly, though Sarah didn't yet recognize the signs. Her sketchbook had become a detailed record of systematic abuse. Her artistic abilities had been weaponized against her, and her support systems had been either compromised or eliminated entirely. But Sarah possessed something her tormentors couldn't destroy: perfect visual memory and the artistic skill to transform truth into undeniable evidence. The documentation she had been creating throughout her ordeal was about to become the foundation for a revelation that would expose the sophisticated cruelty operating beneath Westfield High's polished surface. The stage was set for a confrontation that would transform victim into victor, silence into voice, and hidden truth into public revelation. Sarah Mitchell was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful response to systematic cruelty is systematic documentation followed by strategic revelation. Part 5, The Point of No Return. The third week of November brought with it an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the approaching Thanksgiving holiday. At Westfield High, tension was building towards something unprecedented, though only one person understood the true scope of what was about to unfold. Sarah Mitchell had been pushed beyond her breaking point, but instead of shattering, she had discovered something harder and more dangerous than her tormentors had anticipated: absolute clarity about the situation and her place within it. The realization had come during a particularly brutal morning in the main hallway, when Brittany Walsh orchestrated what appeared to be a spontaneous encounter, but was actually a carefully planned public humiliation. Sarah had been walking toward her first period class, her messenger bag secure across her shoulder and her route calculated to avoid known trouble spots, when she found herself surrounded by what seemed like a casual gathering of students near her locker. The positioning was too perfect to be accidental, creating a narrow corridor that she would have to navigate while being observed by multiple witnesses. Brittany emerged from the center of the group like a spider revealing herself. In her web, her smile radiating the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. The dance team captain had spent weeks building toward this moment, gathering intelligence and positioning resources for maximum impact. "Sarah, we need to have a serious conversation," Brittany announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Your behavior has become a real problem for everyone in this school, and it's time to address it directly." The gathering crowd wasn't accidental. Brittany had used her extensive social network to ensure that the right witnesses would be present at precisely the right moment. Students from every major social group were represented, creating an audience that could spread whatever narrative emerged from this confrontation throughout the entire school population within hours. Sarah stopped, walking, recognizing that retreat was no longer possible. The corridor behind her had been subtly blocked by Amber Stevens and several volleyball players, while the path forward was controlled by Brittany's inner circle. She was trapped in a space designed for maximum visibility and minimum escape options. "I don't know what you think I've done wrong," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. I just come to school, go to classes, and try not to bother anyone. Chloe Martinez stepped forward with a manila folder in her hands, presenting it like evidence at a trial. That's exactly the problem. You think you're invisible, but you're actually watching and documenting everyone constantly. We have proof of your obsessive behavior. The folder contained printouts of Sarah's social media accounts, which were minimal and contained no controversial content, but Chloe presented them as if they revealed disturbing secrets. More importantly, the folder contained photographs that had been taken of Sarah without her knowledge, showing her in various locations around the school with her sketchbook open. "Look at these pictures," Brittany said, displaying the surveillance photos to the gathered crowd. "She's always drawing, always watching, always collecting information about people who never gave her permission to document them. This isn't normal behavior." Sarah realized with growing horror that she had been under surveillance while conducting her own documentation project. Her tormentors had been gathering evidence against her with the same systematic approach she'd been using to record their harassment. The irony was bitter and disorienting. "Those are just drawings," Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. The photos made her artistic practice appear obsessive and threatening when viewed through the lens that Brittany was providing. "Artists draw what they see. It's completely normal." "Normal artists don't hide in corners stalking their subjects," Ember interjected, moving closer to eliminate Sarah's personal space. "Normal artists ask permission before turning people into their private collection of creepy portraits." The crowd was growing larger as passing students were drawn by the spectacle of confrontation. Sarah could see teachers moving through distant hallways, but none were close enough to intervene in what appeared to be a student discussion rather than an aggressive encounter. Brittany produced her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be a prepared presentation. "We've been documenting Sarah's disturbing behavior for weeks now. The constant staring, the secret drawing, the antisocial isolation patterns. We're concerned that she might be planning something dangerous." The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Brittany was characterizing her defensive behaviors as evidence of potential violence, transforming victim into threat with calculated precision. The implication that she might be planning some kind of attack was designed to make her presence at school seem dangerous rather than vulnerable. "That's completely ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice rising slightly despite her attempts to remain calm. "I've never hurt anyone or threatened anyone. I just want to be left alone to finish school." "That's exactly what someone planning something would say," Chloe added, her tone suggesting she was making a profound psychological observation. Isolation and obsessive documentation are classic warning signs of problematic thinking patterns. The crowd was now large enough to block normal hallway traffic, forcing other students to navigate around the confrontation. Sarah could see phones being raised to record the encounter, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved and shared across social media platforms within minutes. Ms. Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the crowd, drawn by the unusual gathering and the obvious distress radiating from the situation. The art teacher immediately recognized Sarah at the center of what appeared to be a coordinated attack, but the number of students involved made direct intervention complicated. "What's going on here?" Ms. Rodriguez asked, using her teacher voice to project authority across the gathered crowd. "Why isn't everyone in class?" Brittany turned to address the teacher with perfectly crafted respect and concern. "Ms. Rodriguez, we're really glad you're here. We've been trying to help. Sarah understands that her behavior is making other students uncomfortable. Maybe you could talk to her about appropriate social boundaries." The request was masterfully constructed to make Brittany appear helpful while positioning Sarah as the problem requiring adult intervention. Ms. Rodriguez found herself being asked to discipline her most talented student based on accusations from students who had never shown concern for anyone's well-being before. "Sarah, is everything all right?" Ms. Rodriguez asked, trying to communicate support while navigating the complicated dynamics of the situation. Sarah looked into her teacher's eyes and saw genuine concern, but also the confusion of an adult trying to understand a situation that had been deliberately obscured by her tormentors. The moment required a choice: continue pretending that everything was manageable or reveal the truth about what had been happening for months. "They've been harassing me since I got here," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent crowd. "Every day, multiple times a day, they've been tripping me, insulting me, spreading rumors about me, and trying to get me in trouble with teachers and administrators." The admission created a ripple of reaction through the gathered students. Some looked uncomfortable at having the underlying dynamics exposed so directly, while others appeared skeptical of Sarah's claims. Brittany's expression shifted to one of wounded innocence, as if she were being falsely accused of terrible behavior. "That's exactly the kind of paranoid thinking we're worried about," Brittany said, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "Sarah seems to believe that normal teenage interactions are actually coordinated attacks against her. That's really concerning psychological territory." Amber nodded in agreement, adding her own psychological analysis. "When someone isolates themselves and then starts seeing enemies everywhere, that's when schools start having serious problems. We're trying to prevent a dangerous situation before it gets worse." Ms. Rodriguez recognized that she was witnessing something more complex than a simple student disagreement. The sophisticated nature of the accusations and counter-accusations suggested a conflict that had been developing over time, but without concrete evidence, she was limited in her ability to determine truth from manipulation. "I think everyone should head to their classes now," Ms. Rodriguez said, using her authority to disperse the crowd. "Sarah, please come with me to the art room. Everyone else, you should be in first period by now." The crowd began to reluctantly disperse, but not before several students had captured significant portions of the confrontation on their phones. The encounter would be replayed and analyzed across social media platforms throughout the day, with interpretations varying based on existing loyalties and biases. Brittany made a point of approaching Ms. Rodriguez before leaving. "Please talk to her about getting professional help. We're really worried about what might happen if her behavior continues to escalate." The parting comment was designed to plant seeds of doubt in the teacher's mind about Sarah's mental stability. By positioning herself as concerned for Sarah's well-being, Brittany was actually ensuring that any future support for Sarah would be filtered through questions about her psychological state. As Sarah walked toward the art room with Ms. Rodriguez, she felt the weight of every stare from the dispersing crowd. The public confrontation had accomplished exactly what Brittany had intended. It had made Sarah's presence at school appear problematic and potentially dangerous, while positioning her tormentors as concerned citizens trying to prevent catastrophe. Inside the art room, Ms. Rodriguez closed the door and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. The familiar environment provided some comfort, but Sarah could feel the teacher's uncertainty about how to address what had just occurred. "Sarah, I need you to help me understand what's really happening," Ms. Rodriguez said gently. "The situation out there felt very orchestrated, but I'm having trouble determining who was orchestrating what." Sarah realized that this moment represented her last opportunity to receive adult support before the situation escalated beyond any possibility of intervention. The choice was between continued silence that protected her tormentors or full disclosure that might finally bring consequences for their behavior. "I have proof," Sarah said quietly, reaching for her messenger bag. "I've been documenting everything that's happened to me since I got here." Every incident, every person involved, every witness who did nothing. I have it all drawn in perfect detail. She extracted her sketchbook and opened it to the first page of documentation, revealing a drawing so accurate it looked like a photograph. The image showed Amber Stevens extending her foot to trip Sarah in a crowded hallway, with timestamp notations and detailed environmental context that would make denial impossible. Ms. Rodriguez examined the drawing with growing amazement and concern. The artistic skill was extraordinary, but more importantly, the level of detail suggested that Sarah had been experiencing systematic harassment while feeling unable to report it through normal channels. Sarah, these drawings are incredible. Evidence, Ms. Rodriguez said, flipping through pages of documented incidents. Why didn't you bring these to administration earlier? This level of systematic behavior is completely unacceptable. Because I knew they wouldn't believe me, Sarah replied, her voice carrying the exhaustion of months of isolation. Brittany is too smart to get caught by teachers, and she's too popular for administrators to want to discipline her. The drawings were just for me to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. Ms. Rodriguez continued examining the documentation, seeing a pattern of harassment that was far more sophisticated and extensive than anything she had previously encountered. The drawings revealed not just individual incidents, but a coordinated campaign designed to systematically destroy a student's sense of safety and belonging. This needs to go to Principal Henderson immediately, Ms. Rodriguez said firmly. This isn't normal teenage conflict. This is systematic harassment that requires serious intervention. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect of official action. For months, she had fantasized about adult intervention that would make the harassment stop, but she had also feared the potential escalation that might result from challenging Brittany's social dominance directly. What if they don't believe the drawings? Sarah asked. What if they say I made it all up? Ms. Rodriguez studied the detailed artwork with professional appreciation for both the artistic skill and the evidential value. Sarah, these drawings are so accurate and detailed that they constitute documentary evidence. No one could fabricate this level of specific detail about incidents that didn't actually occur. The bell rang for second period, but both teacher and student ignored it. The conversation had reached a critical juncture that couldn't be interrupted. By normal school scheduling, Sarah's documentation was about to be transformed from private coping mechanism into public evidence that would expose the sophisticated cruelty operating beneath Westfield High's polished surface. There's something else, Sarah said, reaching for additional pages in her sketchbook. I didn't just document what they did to me. I documented what they did to other students, too. I think I'm not the only one being targeted. Ms. Rodriguez looked at the additional drawings and saw evidence of a harassment network that extended far beyond Sarah's individual experience. The sketches showed multiple students being systematically isolated, humiliated, and psychologically tormented by the same group of perpetrators. Sarah, this is evidence of a school-wide bullying operation, Ms. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the gravity of the revelation. These drawings could help other students who have been suffering in silence. Sarah realized that her artistic documentation had captured something larger than her personal experience. She had been unwittingly gathering evidence of a systematic campaign that affected dozens of students who had been too intimidated or isolated to report their experiences. What happens next? Sarah asked, feeling simultaneously empowered and terrified by the prospect of her private documentation becoming public evidence. Ms. Rodriguez stood up and moved toward the door, her decision made. Next, we take this evidence to people who have the authority to stop what's been happening. Your art is about to become the most important truth-telling this school has ever seen. As they prepared to leave the art room together, Sarah felt a fundamental shift in her relationship with her tormentors. For months, she had been the victim of their sophisticated cruelty. But now, she possessed something they couldn't destroy or manipulate: perfect documentation of their systematic harassment. The quiet new girl with the sketchbook was about to become the catalyst for a reckoning that would expose not just individual bullies, but an entire social system that had enabled and protected their behavior. Sarah Mitchell's artistic gift was about to transform from private coping mechanism into public justice. But first, she had to survive the firestorm that truth-telling would unleash. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything at Westfield High, but the most dramatic revelations were still to come. Sarah's documentation was about to become evidence in a case that would reshape how the school understood and addressed systematic harassment. The breaking point had been reached, but instead of breaking, Sarah had discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against organized cruelty is organized truth, captured with perfect clarity and shared with people who have the authority to demand justice. Her artistic abilities were about to become the foundation for a transformation that would echo far beyond the hallways of one high school. The administrative offices of Westfield High had never seen anything quite like what Sarah Mitchell and Ms. Rodriguez brought through their doors that November morning. Principal Henderson looked up from his computer screen to find his most respected art teacher, accompanied by a student he recognized as problematic, carrying what appeared to be a thick portfolio of artwork that both women treated with the reverence typically reserved for legal documents. Ms. Rodriguez had spent the walk from the art room preparing her approach carefully. She understood that administrative intervention required more than artistic appreciation. It demanded concrete evidence presented in language that school officials could translate into actionable policy violations. Sarah's documentation was extraordinary, but its impact would depend entirely on how effectively it could be presented as evidence rather than creative expression. Principal Henderson, we need to discuss a serious situation that has been developing throughout this semester, Ms. Rodriguez began, her professional tone immediately capturing the administrator's full attention. Sarah has been documenting systematic harassment that extends far beyond typical teenage conflicts. Sarah sat quietly beside her teacher, clutching her sketchbook with hands that trembled slightly, despite her determination to see this process through to its conclusion. The months of isolation and systematic torment had led to this moment of potential justice, but she understood that revelation carried its own risks and consequences. Principal Henderson gestured for them to take seats across from his desk, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to genuine concern as he recognized the gravity in Ms. Rodriguez's demeanor. In 12 years of educational administration, he had developed an instinct for distinguishing between routine student complaints and situations that required immediate intervention. "What kind of documentation are we talking about?" Principal Henderson asked, his administrative training engaging as he prepared to assess evidence and determine appropriate responses. Ms. Rodriguez opened Sarah's sketchbook to the first page of harassment documentation, revealing a drawing, so detailed and accurate that it functioned as a photograph might in a legal proceeding. The image showed a specific incident with timestamp notations, environmental context, and facial expressions captured with courtroom-quality precision. Sarah has been creating visual records of every harassment incident she's experienced, along with systematic targeting of other students by the same group of perpetrators, Ms. Rodriguez explained, turning pages to reveal the scope of the documentation. Her artistic abilities have allowed her to preserve evidence that would otherwise be impossible to capture. Principal Henderson examined the drawings with growing amazement and concern. His administrative experience had taught him to be skeptical of student accusations that couldn't be substantiated, but the level of detail and consistency in Sarah's artwork made denial impossible. These were not the exaggerated complaints of an oversensitive teenager. They were precise documentation of systematic cruelty. "These drawings are remarkable," Principal Henderson said, studying a particularly detailed scene that showed multiple students participating in what appeared to be a coordinated humiliation. "How long has this been going on?" "Since I started here in September," Sarah replied quietly, finding her voice despite the intimidating nature of the administrative setting. "Every day, sometimes multiple times per day. I started drawing because I thought I might be imagining how bad it was, but the pictures don't lie." Ms. Rodriguez turned to a section of the sketchbook that documented harassment of other students, revealing that Sarah's targeting was part of a larger pattern of systematic intimidation. The drawings showed the same perpetrators using similar tactics against multiple victims, suggesting an organized campaign rather than random teenage cruelty. "This appears to be evidence of a harassment network that extends throughout the school," Ms. Rodriguez observed, her teacher's instincts recognizing patterns that might escape administrative notice. Sarah's documentation reveals systematic targeting that has been operating below the radar of adult supervision. Principal Henderson studied the evidence with the gravity of someone who understood the legal and ethical implications of what he was seeing. Schools faced serious liability issues when systematic harassment was allowed to continue, and the documentation before him suggested that Westfield High had a significant problem that required immediate intervention. "Sarah, why didn't you report these incidents when they were happening?" Principal Henderson asked, his tone conveying concern rather than criticism. "This level of systematic harassment should have been brought to administrative attention immediately." Sarah looked down at her sketchbook, gathering courage to explain months of isolation and systematic intimidation. "I knew that Brittany Walsh and her friends were too popular and too smart to get caught by teachers. They're careful to make everything look accidental or justified. I thought no one would believe me without proof." The mention of Brittany Walsh caused Principal Henderson's expression to shift slightly. The dance team captain was the daughter of one of Westfield's most influential families, a student who had never appeared on his disciplinary radar despite her prominent role in school social dynamics. The idea that she might be orchestrating systematic harassment required a fundamental reassessment of his understanding of student leadership. "These drawings suggest a level of coordination and planning that goes far beyond typical teenage conflicts," Principal Henderson said, continuing to examine the evidence. "If these incidents occurred as documented, we're looking at serious policy violations that require immediate investigation." Ms. Rodriguez recognized the moment when administrative concern shifted into action mode. Principal Henderson was no longer evaluating whether intervention was necessary. He was planning how to implement consequences for behavior that clearly violated school policies and potentially state anti-harassment laws. "I want to call in the students identified in these drawings for individual interviews," Principal Henderson said, reaching for his phone to contact his assistant. "We need to investigate these allegations thoroughly and implement appropriate disciplinary measures." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror at the prospect of official investigation. For months, she had fantasized about adult intervention that would make the harassment stop. But she also understood that challenging Brittany Walsh's social dominance would likely trigger retaliation before any protective measures could be implemented. "What about my safety while the investigation is happening?" Sarah asked, her practical concerns overriding her satisfaction at finally being believed. "If Brittany finds out that I reported her, she's going to escalate everything she's been doing. Principal Henderson paused in his planning to address Sarah's legitimate security concerns. Administrative investigations took time, and students who reported harassment often faced intensified targeting during the period between accusation and resolution. Protecting Sarah while maintaining due process for the accused students would require careful coordination. We'll implement immediate protective measures while the investigation proceeds, Principal Henderson assured her. You'll have supervised transitions between classes, alternative lunch arrangements, and direct access to administrative support if any incidents occur. Ms. Rodriguez suggested an additional protective measure that could serve multiple purposes. Sarah's artwork deserves recognition beyond its evidential value. I'd like to propose that we arrange for her work to be displayed in the upcoming student art exhibition. Her talent should be celebrated, and public recognition might provide additional protection. The suggestion sparked an idea that would transform Sarah's private documentation into public advocacy. Principal Henderson realized that Sarah's artistic abilities could become a powerful tool for education and prevention, turning individual trauma into community awareness about the realities of systematic harassment. What if we went further than just displaying the artwork? Principal Henderson proposed. What if we use Sarah's documentation as the centerpiece of a school-wide presentation about bullying and harassment? Students need to see the real impact of behavior they might dismiss as harmless teasing. Sarah felt simultaneously thrilled and terrified by the prospect of her private documentation becoming public advocacy. The idea that her months of suffering could be transformed into education that might protect other students was empowering, but it also meant exposing her most vulnerable moments to the entire school community. "I want to do it," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "If my drawings can help other students who are going through what I went through, then they need to be seen." Ms. Rodriguez smiled with pride at her students' courage and growth. The quiet new girl, who had spent months trying to remain invisible, was choosing to make herself the most visible advocate for justice that Westfield High had ever seen. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Principal Henderson interviewed dozens of students, reviewed security footage, and consulted with district legal counsel about appropriate disciplinary measures. Sarah's artistic documentation provided a roadmap for investigation that made denial impossible and cover-up unlikely. Brittany Walsh's interview was particularly revealing. Confronted with specific drawings that captured her coordinated harassment campaigns, she initially attempted to characterize Sarah's documentation as evidence of mental instability. But the precision and consistency of the artwork, combined with corroborating testimony from other students, made her defense strategy untenable. "These drawings are completely exaggerated," Brittany protested, examining artwork that captured her expressions and actions with photographic accuracy. "Sarah is obviously disturbed and has been creating fantasy scenarios where she's the victim of imaginary persecution." Principal Henderson placed additional drawings on the table, showing Brittany's systematic targeting of multiple students using identical tactics. The pattern of behavior was undeniable, and the artistic evidence was supported by testimony from students who had previously been too intimidated to report their experiences. "Brittany, these drawings document specific incidents that occurred on specific dates in specific locations," Principal Henderson said firmly. "Multiple witnesses have corroborated these events. We're not dealing with imagination. We're dealing with systematic harassment that violates school policies and state laws." The disciplinary consequences were severe and immediate. Brittany faced suspension, removal from her leadership position on the dance team, and mandatory counseling for harassment behavior. Amber Stevens and Chloe Martinez received similar disciplinary measures, while students who had participated in the harassment campaign faced consequences proportional to their involvement. But the most significant transformation occurred when Sarah's artwork was displayed throughout the main hallway of Westfield High. Her drawings, professionally mounted and accompanied by explanatory text about harassment recognition and prevention, created a powerful exhibition that forced the entire school community to confront uncomfortable truths about their social dynamics. The exhibition opening drew hundreds of students, parents, and community members who came to see artwork that local media had described as documentary evidence that exposes the hidden reality of systematic school harassment. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss her experience and express support for her courage in speaking truth through art. "I never realized how sophisticated harassment could be," said Jake Thompson, the quiet computer lab student who approached Sarah during the exhibition opening. "Your drawings show patterns that I experienced but never understood as connected. Thank you for being brave enough to document the truth." The response from other students was overwhelmingly supportive, though Sarah recognized that some of the enthusiasm came from people who were relieved to see popular students face consequences for behavior that had made many people uncomfortable. Her documentation had given voice to students who had felt powerless against systematic cruelty. Ms. Rodriguez stood beside her student during the exhibition, watching Sarah transform from isolated victim into confident advocate. The quiet, new girl who had spent months trying to remain invisible had become the most visible force for positive change that Westfield High had experienced in years. "Your artwork has started a conversation that needed to happen," Ms. Rodriguez told Sarah, as they watched students examining the drawings with intense interest. "You've shown that art can be more than personal expression. It can be a tool for justice and social change." The long-term impact of Sarah's revelation extended far beyond individual disciplinary actions. Westfield High implemented new policies for harassment prevention and response, created anonymous reporting systems for students who witnessed inappropriate behavior, and established ongoing education programs about respect and inclusion. Sarah's artistic abilities were finally recognized and celebrated appropriately. She received scholarship offers from multiple universities, impressed by both her technical skill and her courage in using art as advocacy. Her documentation project became a model for other schools dealing with systematic harassment, proving that creative response could be more powerful than traditional reporting mechanisms. The transformation was complete when Brittany Walsh approached Sarah 3 weeks after the exhibition opening. The former dance team captain looked smaller somehow, diminished by consequences and the loss of social status that had defined her identity. "I wanted to apologize," Brittany said quietly, avoiding eye contact as she struggled with unfamiliar humility. "What I did to you, what I did to other people, it was wrong. I thought I was just maintaining social order, but your drawings showed me how cruel I actually was." Sarah studied her former tormentor carefully, recognizing genuine remorse in someone who had previously seemed incapable of empathy. The systematic harassment had stopped completely, but more importantly, it had been replaced by awareness and accountability that made repetition unlikely. "Thank you for saying that," Sarah replied, choosing forgiveness over continued anger. "I hope you understand now that everyone deserves to feel safe at school, regardless of their social status or family circumstances." The conversation marked the final transformation in Sarah's journey from victim to victor. She had not only survived systematic harassment, but had transformed her survival into advocacy that protected other students and changed institutional culture. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell graduated as valedictorian of her class. Her academic achievements finally recognized and celebrated by a school community that had learned to appreciate rather than fear differences. Her artwork was permanently displayed in Westfield High's main entrance, serving as an ongoing reminder that systematic cruelty would not be tolerated and that individual courage could create institutional change. The quiet new girl who had been tripped 17 times in her first month at Westfield High had become the most powerful voice for justice the school had ever produced. Her sketchbook, which had begun as a private coping mechanism, had transformed into evidence that exposed systematic cruelty and created lasting protection for vulnerable students. Sarah's story proved that sometimes the most effective response to organized harassment is organized documentation, that artistic talent can become a tool for justice, and that individual courage can transform institutional culture. The girl, who had spent months trying to remain invisible, had become impossible to ignore, and her impact would protect students for generations to come. The transformation was complete. Victim had become victor, silence had become voice, and hidden truth had become public revelation that changed everything. Sarah Mitchell had discovered that the most powerful weapon against systematic cruelty was systematic truth, captured with perfect clarity and shared with people who had the authority and courage to demand justice. The transformation that swept through Westfield High in the weeks following Sarah's revelation was unlike anything the school had experienced in its 40-year history. What began as one student's private documentation of systematic harassment had evolved into a community-wide reckoning that exposed uncomfortable truths about power dynamics, social hierarchies, and the collective responsibility adults bore for protecting vulnerable students. Sarah Mitchell stood before the packed auditorium on a crisp December morning, her presentation materials arranged on the podium with the precision of someone who had learned to trust in preparation and evidence. Rather than hope and wishful thinking, the monthly school assembly had been transformed into something unprecedented. A student-led symposium on harassment recognition, artistic advocacy, and the power of systematic truth-telling to create institutional change. The audience represented every segment of the Westfield High community. Students filled the main floor seating, their expressions ranging from supportive anticipation to uncomfortable curiosity about what their previously invisible classmate might reveal. Parents occupied the balcony section, many having requested time off from work to witness what local media had described as a groundbreaking presentation about student empowerment and administrative accountability. Teachers and staff members lined the walls, their presence reflecting both professional obligation and genuine interest in understanding how systematic harassment had operated undetected within their daily supervision. Principal Henderson sat in the front row, his positioning deliberately demonstrating administrative support for Sarah's advocacy while acknowledging institutional failures that had allowed the documented cruelty to flourish unchallenged. Ms. Rodriguez operated the presentation technology from her position near the stage, her pride in her students' growth evident in every careful adjustment of lighting and sound levels. The art teacher had spent weeks collaborating with Sarah to transform private documentation into public education, ensuring that traumatic experiences would be presented as empowering lessons rather than sensational entertainment. 6 months ago, I was the invisible new girl who ate lunch alone and tried to navigate hallways without attracting attention, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent auditorium. Today, I'm here to share what I learned about systematic harassment, artistic documentation, and the power that comes from refusing to remain silent about injustice. The opening statement immediately established Sarah's transformation while acknowledging the journey that had brought her to this moment of public advocacy. She had chosen to begin with personal narrative rather than accusation, creating space for audience connection before introducing more challenging concepts about collective responsibility and institutional change. Sarah activated her first slide, revealing a self-portrait she had created during her earliest days at Westfield High. The drawing showed a girl hunched over her sketchbook, shoulders curved defensively, eyes downcast to avoid unwanted attention. The artistic skill was extraordinary, but more importantly, the emotional content captured the psychological state of someone who had learned to make herself small in hostile environments. "This is how I saw myself when I first arrived at Westfield," Sarah explained, studying her own artwork with the analytical distance she had developed over months of processing trauma through creative expression. "I thought invisibility was safety, that if I could avoid notice, I could avoid conflict. What I didn't understand was that systematic harassment doesn't require visibility to begin. It requires vulnerability, and new students are automatically vulnerable regardless of their behavior." The audience studied the self-portrait with growing recognition of the isolation and defensive positioning that many students had observed, but never consciously acknowledged. Sarah's artistic ability to capture psychological states made abstract concepts concrete, allowing viewers to understand experiences they might never have personally encountered. The next series of slides revealed Sarah's documentation process, showing how private coping mechanisms had evolved into systematic evidence gathering. Each drawing was accompanied by explanatory text that described the incident depicted, the patterns revealed through multiple occurrences, and the psychological impact of systematic intimidation on targeted individuals. "I started drawing because I thought I might be imagining how bad things were," Sarah continued, displaying a detailed sketch that showed Brittany Walsh coordinating a hallway ambush with military precision. But artwork doesn't lie, and patterns become impossible to deny when they're documented with visual accuracy. The drawing was so detailed and specific that audience members could identify exact locations within their school, recognize facial expressions that captured personality traits with uncomfortable accuracy, and understand the sophisticated planning that had gone into seemingly spontaneous harassment incidents. Sarah's photographic memory had preserved evidence that would have been impossible to capture through traditional reporting mechanisms. Principal Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat as the presentation revealed the extent of systematic harassment that had operated beneath administrative awareness. The evidence suggested institutional failures that extended beyond individual oversights, indicating that existing policies and supervision methods were inadequate for detecting sophisticated social cruelty. Sarah advanced to slides that documented harassment of multiple students, revealing that her targeting had been part of a larger pattern of systematic intimidation that affected dozens of vulnerable individuals. The drawings showed the same perpetrators, using identical tactics against different victims, suggesting coordination and planning that elevated the behavior far beyond typical teenage meanness. What I discovered through my documentation was that systematic harassment operates like an organized campaign, Sarah explained, displaying a chart that tracked harassment patterns across multiple victims and timeframes. It requires coordination, planning, and the passive participation of witnesses who choose not to intervene when they observe cruelty occurring. The passive participation element created visible discomfort among audience members who recognized their own inaction in the scenario Sarah was describing. Students who had witnessed harassment incidents without intervening found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about their own moral responsibility for outcomes they had chosen not to influence. A particularly powerful slide showed a wide-angle view of the cafeteria during one of Sarah's public humiliations, with detailed annotations identifying every student who had observed the incident without offering assistance. The drawing revealed that systematic harassment succeeded not just through active cruelty, but through collective indifference that allowed predators to operate without social consequences. Systematic harassment requires systematic response, Sarah continued, advancing to slides that outlined the institutional changes implemented following her revelation. Individual courage is necessary but not sufficient. Communities must create structures that protect vulnerable members and impose consequences for predatory behavior. The presentation shifted from documentation to advocacy as Sarah outlined specific policy recommendations based on her research into effective harassment prevention strategies. Her suggestions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics and practical knowledge about implementation challenges that impressed the adult administrators present. Sarah displayed her artistic technique through live demonstration, showing how photographic memory could be translated into documentary evidence through careful observation and skilled execution. The audience watched in amazement as she recreated a complex scene from memory, adding details that revealed the systematic nature of social dynamics they had previously viewed as random or natural. "Art became my weapon against organized cruelty," Sarah explained, her pencil moving with mechanical precision across the demonstration paper. "But more importantly, it became my voice for speaking truths that people needed to hear, even when those truths were uncomfortable or challenging." The demonstration revealed the extraordinary level of talent that had been hidden during Sarah's months of invisibility, making audience members reconsider their assumptions about quiet students and overlooked individuals. The girl they had dismissed as unremarkable possessed abilities that professional artists would envy, and she had used those abilities to create undeniable evidence of institutional failures. Ms. Rodriguez approached the microphone to provide professional context for Sarah's artistic achievements. "In 25 years of teaching, I've never encountered a student with Sarah's combination of technical skill and social consciousness," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of extensive experience. Her artwork transcends personal expression to become documentary evidence that has transformed our understanding of student experiences. The teacher's endorsement carried significant weight with audience members who might have questioned Sarah's credibility or motivations. Ms. Rodriguez had established reputation for professional integrity and educational excellence, making her support powerful validation for Sarah's advocacy efforts. The presentation reached its emotional climax when Sarah displayed her final series of drawings showing the positive transformation that had occurred following administrative intervention. The images revealed students who had previously been isolated finding connection and support, former perpetrators engaging in restorative justice processes, and institutional changes that prioritize protection over popularity. Change is possible when communities choose to prioritize protection over comfort, Sarah concluded, her final slide showing a group portrait of students from different social backgrounds working together on a collaborative art project. But change requires courage from individuals who are willing to speak truth even when silence feels safer. The standing ovation that followed was immediate and sustained, with audience members rising spontaneously to acknowledge both Sarah's courage and the institutional transformation she had catalyzed. The applause represented more than appreciation for artistic skill. It was recognition of moral leadership that had emerged from the most unlikely source. Students who had never spoken to Sarah approached her after the presentation to share their own experiences of harassment and express gratitude for advocacy that had created safer environments for vulnerable individuals. The conversation revealed that systematic intimidation had affected far more students than anyone had previously understood, and that Sarah's courage had given voice to experiences that had been suffering in isolation. Jake Thompson, the computer lab student who had previously avoided association with controversial figures, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching Sarah directly. "Your presentation changed how I understand my own responsibility," he told her quietly. "I witnessed harassment incidents without intervening because I thought it wasn't my business. But now I understand that inaction is actually participation." The acknowledgement of moral responsibility represented the deeper transformation that Sarah's advocacy had achieved. Beyond policy changes and disciplinary consequences, her revelation had forced community members to examine their own roles in systems that enabled cruelty through collective indifference. Parents approached Principal Henderson with questions about harassment prevention strategies and requests for ongoing education programs that would help them recognize warning signs in their own children's behavior. The presentation had revealed that systematic cruelty often operated with parental ignorance, making family education essential for sustainable prevention efforts. "We want to ensure that no other student experiences what Sarah documented," said Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter had been a witness to several harassment incidents without understanding their systematic nature. "How can we create accountability that extends beyond school hours and into community expectations?" The question reflected growing recognition that harassment prevention required community-wide commitment rather than institutional policy alone. Sarah's documentation had revealed that systematic cruelty operated across multiple environments, making coordinated response necessary for effective intervention. Local media coverage of Sarah's presentation extended the impact beyond Westfield High's immediate community. Regional newspapers featured articles about artistic advocacy and student empowerment, while television news programs highlighted innovative approaches to harassment prevention that other schools could adapt for their own populations. The State Department of Education contacted Principal Henderson to request copies of Sarah's presentation materials for distribution to schools throughout the region. Her documentation methods and advocacy strategies were being recognized as model approaches that could be replicated in other institutional contexts where systematic harassment might be operating undetected. Sarah found herself invited to speak at education conferences and policy forums, where her artistic approach to documentation was being studied as innovative evidence-gathering methodology. The quiet new girl who had spent months trying to remain invisible had become a recognized expert on harassment recognition and prevention strategies. The scholarship offers that followed reflected recognition of both Sarah's artistic abilities and her demonstrated leadership in social justice advocacy. Universities were competing to recruit a student who had proven capable of transforming personal trauma into institutional change through creative problem-solving and moral courage. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation occurred 6 months later when Brittany Walsh approached Sarah in the hallway near the permanent display of harassment documentation artwork. The former dance team captain had completed her suspension and counseling requirements, returning to school as a significantly changed individual who was struggling to rebuild her identity around healthier values. "I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the community center, working with middle school students who are experiencing bullying," Brittany said quietly, her former arrogance replaced by genuine humility. "Your artwork helped me understand the real impact of behavior I thought was just social management. I'm trying to use my experience to prevent other kids from making the mistakes I made." The conversation represented complete role reversal from their previous dynamics. Sarah now occupied the position of respected leadership, while Brittany worked to rebuild credibility through service to vulnerable populations. The systematic intimidation had been replaced by restorative justice that focused on education and prevention rather than punishment alone. "That's really important work," Sarah replied, choosing encouragement over past grievances. "Understanding how harassment operates is the first step toward preventing it, and your perspective as someone who participated in systematic intimidation could help other students recognize warning signs in their own behavior." The exchange demonstrated Sarah's growth from victim to leader, showing magnanimity and wisdom that impressed observers who witnessed the interaction. She had learned to use power responsibly, focusing on positive change rather than retribution or continued conflict. 1 year after her presentation, Sarah was selected as Westfield High's nominee for the state's Student Advocate of the Year award, recognition that celebrated her transformation of personal adversity into community benefit. The nomination cited her innovative use of artistic documentation, her courage in speaking truth to institutional power, and her ongoing commitment to protecting vulnerable students. The award ceremony took place in the state capitol, where Sarah's artwork was displayed, alongside advocacy projects from students throughout the region. Her documentation had become part of a larger movement toward transparency and accountability in educational institutions, inspiring similar projects in schools that had previously ignored systematic harassment. Sarah's acceptance speech focused on the collective responsibility that effective advocacy required, emphasizing that individual courage was meaningless without institutional support and community commitment to protecting vulnerable members. Her message resonated with audience members who recognized the broader applications of her advocacy model. "Systematic problems require systematic solutions," Sarah concluded, her voice carrying the confidence that came from proven success in creating positive change. But systematic solutions begin with individual courage to document truth, speak honestly about uncomfortable realities, and insist that institutions prioritize protection over convenience. The standing ovation that followed acknowledged not just Sarah's individual achievements, but the broader transformation she had catalyzed. Her journey from invisible victim to recognized advocate had demonstrated that positive change was possible when communities chose to prioritize justice over comfort. As Sarah returned to Westfield High with her state recognition, she found a school that bore little resemblance to the hostile environment she had first encountered. The hallways were monitored more effectively, students intervened when they witnessed inappropriate behavior, and administration responded quickly to reports of harassment or intimidation. But perhaps most importantly, the culture had shifted to celebrate differences rather than punish them. Students who might previously have been targets for systematic intimidation found support and protection from peers who had learned to value diversity and individual expression. Sarah's artwork remained permanently displayed near the school's main entrance, serving as ongoing reminder that systematic cruelty would not be tolerated and that individual voices could create institutional change when supported by community commitment to justice and protection. The quiet new girl who had been tripped 17 times in her first month at Westfield High had become the most powerful force for positive transformation the school had ever produced. Her sketchbook, which had begun as private coping mechanism, had evolved into evidence that protected vulnerable students and created lasting cultural change. Sarah Mitchell's story proved that artistic talent could become social justice tool, that systematic documentation could overcome organized cruelty, and that individual courage could transform institutional culture when supported by community commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. The transformation was complete and permanent, creating legacy that would protect students for generations to come, while inspiring similar advocacy efforts in communities throughout the region and beyond. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.